Hello, beautiful listeners. Tancil. Real quick before we get into today's episode, I want to let you know that I did mispronounce the name of the podcast within the first few moments. Love that for me. I was just nervous. The name of this podcast is Sunshines from Rainbows. Cute, I know. I also forgot to apparently introduce my pronouns while I'm not doing my job. I do go by he, they. I also wanted to give a quick trigger warning. Within this episode, we do touch on homophobia, and briefly mention, the events of the Holocaust, before moving on. So just wanted to let you guys know that ahead of time in case any of you are sensitive to those topics. And without further ado, let's get into today's episode.
Do you want to do it?
You can do it. You know what we're doing more.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to, put this in between us more.
All right.
So we can hear better.
Slay.
We are recording, by the way.
really?
Well, you can just...
Well, that's a good way to start the recording.
Honestly, we can just leave it in. It's the vibe.
It's the vibe. That's her.
It's the vibe.
That's the intro jingle. Slay. All right. Hello, beautiful listeners and people. Welcome to the first episodical installment of our queer history podcast titled From Rainbows to Sunshine. I am your host, Tancil Martin. I go by he, they pronouns, and I am finishing up my education in Glenside, PA. I have an art history background, as well as history background. And along with my co-host, who will introduce themselves momentarily, we are going to be expanding a bit on a historical conversation of queer identity and queer people identifying, works and media throughout history and creating that, outlining that timeline towards the present. And so today with me, I have the wonderful, the amazing Jaskier.
Hello. Amazing. Wonderful. Hi, my name is Jaskier, and my pronouns are he, they. And welcome to our podcast. I'm so excited. I'm an English major, creative writing. I want to be an author. So Tans is going to bring in, more of the art major aspect, and I'm going to bring in more of the media studies aspect when we comes to, TV shows, literature, and history kind of surrounding all of it. So we are... Should we get started with the episode?
Let's get started. But first of all, Jaskier, how was your week?
It's been a
Or
week.
I guess weekend, would be like.
It's been a week. I'm playing D&D, so the last session was something. It was amazing. We had the bi chaos.
Oh my gosh.
It's a great way to start this episode.
We're already outlining everything so freaking well.
I did not you go into D&D and you're just like, it's going to be bi chaos, and you just don't know who's gonna embody it, and it was the rogue. I did not expect it to be the rogue, but we're
it's
here.
Always the rogue. I feel like
It's
rogue
always
is
the
always for
rogue.
the edgy undertones, but also queer undertones.
Well, yeah, I thought it was going to be my best friend, being the first one to start flirting with everybody, because it was the rogue, and I was just that makes sense because she's kind of a little bit based on Vax from.
I saw Watch Season 3. For context, people were talking about Vox Machina, the animated series revolving around the Critical Role D&D group.
Oh, yeah.
Season 3 released recently, and I've been meaning to catch up on it, but apparently
I have hope that Vax is going to not have to choose between Gilmore and Keyleth. I still have hope because he should have broken up with Gilmore at this point, and he has not. So things are looking up for them. Things are looking down for everybody else.
Everyone else? Oh no. No, I don't want to see my babies be hurt. How dare.
Yeah, but it's gonna be fine most likely.
Now you got me stressing out. Speaking of gay news, as of today is October 22nd, Tuesday.
October 22nd.
I am actually going on a mall date tomorrow, and I will be asking my work friend who I've been seeing to be my boyfriend officially.
Yay!
So,
that's
updates.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Updates on that to come. I'm feeling really excited, very good, but it has me all super gayified for, this medium.
I am gay and single. I am homo lone.
Damn, can I even coin that anymore? I can even be like, damn, same. Wow. Anyway, guys, this.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the Renaissance, and so Tancil's going to be talking about the history of that and the kind of hiding queer undertones in the artworks. And we're going to be moving from that into my space, a speculative fiction, sci-fi, fantasy, horror, everything in that sort of sphere, and kind of breaking down three things in that, and mentioning on others. So I'm glad we talked about Vox Machina and Critical Role.
Also, I know y'all can't see, but Jaskier just did the most dramatic arm movements, and it really added to the overall.
I do the most dramatic. I am Jaskier. It is why I chose the name.
That is true.
Okay,
All right.
Let's get started. I'm so excited to hear what you've got to talk about.
No, I'm so excited. So, quick history lesson.
I love history.
1500s, we are going back to the inception of the Renaissance. So, for those who don't know, during this time in Italy, especially in the main cities of Venice and where else? I believe it was Venice.
Well, there's Venice and Florence.
Venice and Florence, correct.
Venice and Florence.
Trade really began to pick up between the popular families, and so with how influential having money during that time period was, these families used the power that was brought to them with their wealth in the growing and expansion of their trade system to emphasize on humanities and art and people and their creativity. One of the more defining families, of course, being the Medici family. But something that I really wanted to delve into were specifically the artists of this time period.
Gay as fuck. Artists are always gay all throughout history.
Artists are always gay. I know y'all don't want to accept it, but trust me. Trust me. If you know
we're
an
going to be
artist,
talking about it. We're going to be talking about it.
If you know an artist, they're probably gay. I'm sorry to break it to you.
Don't be sorry.
There's a very
Being gay
small
is fun.
heterosexual population within the artist community.
It's struggling, but it's getting by.
It is struggling. It's holding on by a thread. Oh my goodness.
People are just realizing that, most people are bisexual. It's kind of in our nature.
It is kind of in our nature. We do be open and fluid and experimenting. The first artist that I kind of wanted to talk about was, we all know him as one of the Ninja Turtles.
Love him.
Well, if you weren't aware that the Ninja Turtles were named after the four famous artists of this period, I don't know what to tell you. But we're going to be starting with Michelangelo, one of the most prominent artists of this time period. You've probably seen a lot of his works, like the 16th Chapel, stuff like that, which if you have not seen that piece, I recommend you look it up. Not only for its detail, but I think it's also important to know how vast and expansive and big it is.
He painted the entire
ceiling. The entire ceiling of the chapel is every inch of it is painted. And I want you to think about
he had to lay on his back,
literally
and
on
just
scaffolding, and just go
hold
for
up
it.
your arm. Your arm has got to be really tight.
Your arm's gonna be so. I already listen when I have my locks and I had to retwist my hair all the time. I hated it all the time because I had to hold my arms up over my head for extended periods of time. I cannot imagine being commissioned to paint an entire religious building, the ceiling of it.
Amazing.
Highly, and with the amount of detail and hyperrealism, that's what I really wanted to get into. So, obviously we are aware that the church had, in this time period, had a very strong grasp on the society and the powerful families within these different cities that were coming to fruition in Italy. Wanted to drive this forward, and they already have very grounded belief systems. So they're obviously going to give their money into strengthening the grounds of their religious beliefs. And so we are seeing an influx, especially from when you go from Baroque to Renaissance, almost this higher emphasis on the human body. Because I also wanted to talk about, if anyone is looking for a thesis idea, this is a good thesis, and I'm so mad that I thought about this in the middle of me doing my thesis. But there is a difference, and you can ask, I'm not going to generalize all artists, but with artists who specifically like have experience in studying anatomy and studying the human form, there is a difference in the way that we, and I mean we as artists who have, had this sort of experience, with the way that we view the human body, that is kind of an homage to this influx and renaissance of, arts and literature and culture, in opposed to and compared to how very, I want to say, hypersexualized the human body is, especially nowadays. Like, I'm sure artists, like, if you're listening to this, you can sort of relate to you being in class and you're in your sketchbook and you're doodling, a human body. You're building it, you're constructing it, you put down the shapes, you're just trying to, like, visualize what a body of a human looks like in your head, and then someone walks by and thinks that you're drawing porn.
Yeah. No, literally, I once drew this mermaid when I was, like, in middle school, and, like, my friend was just like, that's, like, a sexy mermaid, and I'm just, like,
drawing their body. Like, because, like, and I guess this is also a question for, like, why in a lot of these earlier works during this time period, between the 1500s and so on and so forth, you're seeing, almost, not a trend, I would say, but it's more common that a lot of the figures in the paintings are nude. And so obviously that's a big topic of conversation for people who are not that familiar with the standpoint of, art history and what the belief system was, like, of the general community during this time period. But the human body and its nudity wasn't seen as, like, an object, like, especially when we get into conversations of how men and women were portrayed separately in the Renaissance and in past art movements. But the human body itself was seen as nudity was a sense of divinity and your attunement to nature. It was believed that the lesser clothes you had on, the closer you were to God.
That's interesting.
Yeah, like in comparison to how people have shaped the perception and the, like, I want to say requirements and the whole, like, implications of body image around looking a certain way, whereas just your body on its own by itself was enough to put you on such a high pedestal in a society that already revered God so much.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I'm, like, kind of thinking about that in conversation with, like, ancient Greek art and ancient Roman art.
Which I was literally about to pull up.
Oh my god, everything is connected.
Everything is connected. But yeah, it's like there was such, not an innocent, but such a more insightful view of human physicality and humanity as a whole, and the creativeness in this time period was almost an outlet to express an unapologetic, I want to say unapologetic resolve with your humanity, because we're also talking about a time where I believe it was the Black Death plague that was running rampant. So
it was kind of like at the end of it. So, like, the Black Death happened, like, a few centuries before. The Renaissance, like, the plague is over, everybody's celebrating, boom, art.
Right, literally. So it was like this whole sense of, like, also, like, we survived. Like, we as humans, with our convictions and all of our flaws and achievements, we've managed to not abide this time, but make it to the other end, or make our way through this, horrible medical disaster. Let's emphasize what it means to be human, and let's emphasize, what we are and our accomplishments and our journey, and our voices. And so the first piece that I kind of wanted to get into,
The wonderful,
Wonderful.
the amazing, the iconic,
the iconic creation of Adam by
Gay
Michelangelo. So let's talk about gayness just in this time. So obviously, as I said before, the churches were very much in control of the overall culture of these different cities, and city-states. And so we all know, for the most part in religion, the way that, we identify it, especially for us who are practicing either, Catholic faith or Christian faith, or people who have been brought up in those spaces, there is definitely a different set of stakes and rules for men and women and how men and women are able to act. And so if you look up a number of pieces, and I learned this in a class that I took on the Renaissance era, when we start getting into, creating works to signify achievements and closeness to God, women are sort of portrayed as more of these, unless they are literally like of the church or female figures in the belief system or the mythology, they're literally like conveyed as like 2D. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of their portraits, you'll see these side images, like side view of like women, and they're not that much expression, very like bold features, jewelry, like all types of like interesting and expensive looking fabrics all over their bodies. And so it was almost this, and like, yes, it was, I guess at face value, like they are good portraits, but it's also like it sort of removes, and when you compare it to how men were portrayed, these very 3D, like they will paint an entire story to try to tell the man's like journey in one painting, whereas the women like more commonly were just portraits, they're bust up, just looking one way, and it was more about showing what was on them more than the women themselves.
Oh yeah, like I'm thinking about like the Mona Lisa.
Yeah.
Like if you look into it, like that is Da Vinci's most famous work. And the clothes that she was wearing show that like she had like recently had a child.
Right.
So like the clothes were a big focus in the Mona Lisa. Like he didn't even finish her face. No. The clothes were a big focus.
Oh,
and so, that was like, he was like, obsessed with this portrait of this woman. And we are obsessed with this portrait of this woman. We've kind of lost the context about like, this is like, a celebration of her motherhood. And that's why it's so revered.
Yeah, it was, and so like a woman's status, like also during this time period, was attached to marriage also, like, because the church had very like strict ideologies on a woman's role. In that sense, like women were seen more as like the accomplishments of men.
Oh yeah.
So a lot of these portraits are going to show these very important looking, like expensive looking clothing on women, but it's also like it's to characterize them as a trophy for this man who did the accomplishment. And
I'm gonna give you all the jewelry, all the fancy clothes. I got you this money.
Yeah, I literally. Oh. Sugar daddy culture. Honestly, listen, bang for your buck. You gotta make it somehow. I'm saying that now, and they already had the idea back then. But also, as I'm talking about these pieces, these will be available in the description of not only this podcast episode, but also when we start branching out to other platforms, we will also be sure to give public access to these sources so that you can follow along with what we were kind of talking about. But the reason why I find Michelangelo's creation of Adam so interesting, along with other pieces, is that with this whole idea of, women being more 2D while men are more thought out, and men are more like, you know, the care to their bodies, and they're more open to the exception of being Christ-like and being closer to God than women are. I also noticed that when we think about homoeroticism,
we're getting in it. We're finally getting
we're
in it.
getting in it. We have to bring up the attention to detail that men give other men.
My God, yeah.
And so when looking through a lot of these works by Michelangelo, it's like...
I can't wait to talk about Lord of the Rings.
you're getting ready for it. But it's like a lot of, from what I can gather, so from this piece specifically, we have the creation of Adam. So obviously, on the right side, we have God along with, I believe those are cherubs that are behind him, these baby figures that are behind him, you know, coming to Adam during his creation. Adam is also nude. There's almost this divine, like, I don't know how else to describe it but homoeroticism. Like, it's...
look at that. That's so gay.
Like, what? Oh my God.
You good?
No, I'm fine. I've been short-winded all day. But no, it's like this, like, tender, very, like, the only type of air that I can give it is, like, this romantic, you know, positioning of these different male, because it's not only these two on the ends, there are also other nude angels and, you know, people on the outer sides of this piece. And so I think what is so fascinating about this is that you're commissioning, obviously, because, like, as we were talking about before with these powerful families, they wanted to have an emphasis on artwork and have it really, you know, bolster their own belief system. So they're commissioning these artists to create these very, you know, biblically accurate, like supposedly biblically accurate stories from the viewpoint of a very religion-centric community. But like the almost spotlight that you're commissioning and the green light and openness and like almost like preference of the dimensionality of men for the sake of other men who were the ones in power for the most part, because of how shunned and like two-dimensional women were in these spaces. When you're looking at it with that in mind, it's hard to look past any of these and not grasp this sort of like I want to say warm romanticism with men between men relationships, and also in different pieces that we'll touch on. You'll see a lot of like just a bunch of dudes, again, nude, just in one space, that are telling these very important and, you know, foundational biblical tales and accomplishments. But it's like, it's so clearly very based in this men appeasing other male figures throughout their own history, that I think is it's so crazy when you actually like look at all these pieces with the context and you start seeing that trend.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and like, you know, once you get into like the positioning of these characters, and like, you know, I find things, you know, very interesting when you're talking about the sexualities of the artists. Because, you know, oftentimes they would use their lovers as things. So like, you know, basically the entire Renaissance is fan fiction. Fan art.
Yes.
It's biblical fan art and like Greek history fan art.
Right.
Like Greek mythology fan. It's just fan art.
Right. It is literally just fan art. I think that, like, if you were to really look at, because I've sort of talked about, you know, recreating these religious religious moments within their context, but it's like very dramatized.
It's Take Me to Church.
It's very Take Me to Church, but like pristine and very demure, you know, like
very mindful, very cutesy.
Very mindful and very cutesy. It's so heavenly, but it's so delicate and emotional and moving, and
Just, like, look at the way their hands
it
reach
feels
out.
so intimate. It's so intimate.
Like, the way that he's lounging is like, come here, guys. I mean, and then, like, you know, look at it. His wrist is limp.
Yeah, literally. Come on. Where do you think lip wrist came from? It was Adam.
It's the creation of Adam.
It was literally the creation of Adam. But no, like, also, like, on that context of, you know, men in this time period using their, like, you know, younger men that they had with them as these subjects. Women in the church, because I talked about sort of that dichotomy between men and women, were expected to, like, obviously the whole conversation, because we've had this in class before,
Yeah.
of, like, the different rules of sexuality when it comes to men and women.
Mm-hmm.
It was insanely, like, you could see it from a mile away.
Oh, yeah.
Like, women, it was like, you do not have sex, you do not have any sort of relations with a man unless you are married to him and he has won you. And that marriage was seen as, like, that binding factor of, like, this is the woman that you've won, she is yours.
Yeah.
Whereas that same standard was blatantly not kept up for men.
No,
to the point,
and it still is not.
It still is not. But, like, even
Yeah.
goes so far back.
Oh, God.
It is, like, so incredibly far back. How, like, men were given sort of this not excuse, but like, that sort of standard was just never applied to them, because before they married, before they had won their trophy wife, they had men on the side 24/7.
Expected to be bisexual.
Yes, like, I know.
And there's especially within, like, Greco-Roman society, like, it was an expectation to be bisexual.
Yeah.
For men, and then, you know, it was you know, expected that you would eventually marry a woman.
Right.
But until then, you had men. And, you know, once we get into the Victorian period, then that becomes the new standard for women, actually.
Literally, it does.
No, literally, because there were, like, you know, I forget the exact term. I'll have to bring it up when we talk about the 19th century next episode. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it was, like, expected that, like, within boarding school, like, when women started going to boarding schools, like, all girls schools, it was kind of expected that girls were supposed to have, like, relationships with each other to learn how to please their husbands.
Right.
And, you know, I forget where I was going with this. I lost the plot. But yeah, no, Greek. And so, you know, there is this great idealification, that's not a word, but it is now.
It is now.
Of like the Greco-Roman society and the Iranian love.
Right.
And that's kind of reflected in this artwork.
Right. No, definitely. I think for the sake of time,
yes,
the other pieces that I have I'll link these in the description just for you to get a look at what I was talking about the reverence of men and male figures throughout the Renaissance, and sort of how artists implicated this romanticism with it through the way that they made certain decisions within their artwork. But I'm going to move the episode over to Jaskier to sort of go into a more modern take on, you know, queerness and queer coding. So take it over.
Okay, so cool. I mean, you know, another important thing, I don't know if you wanted to mention, just like the coding within the artwork that had to happen when the takeover of the church happened.
Yeah.
Like, there's so much coding.
Yeah.
And so moving into the media studies aspect, we're going to be like examining, like, in depth, like I mentioned before, speculative fiction, and we're going to be looking at 3 different genres: fantasy, horror, and science fiction.
The gayest genre.
The gayest genres. And we're going to be specifically looking at Lord of the Rings,
Okay.
Dracula,
Love.
and X-Men.
Yes.
Okay, so we're not gonna go in a timeline because that would mean starting out with Dracula,
Right.
but we're gonna be talking about Lord of the Rings first. If you want to learn more in depth about, like, the queer history of Lord of the Rings, I highly recommend this video essayist on YouTube called Verily Bitchy, and she's got this like analysis of, like, the queer history of Lord of the Rings.
Right.
However, I kind of slightly disagree with some of the things that she says.
Really?
So basically, if you guys don't know, people love making Sam and Frodo gay. They love making everybody in Lord of the Rings gay because there's like such this strong emotional connection between these characters that just isn't there with the women.
Right.
I mean, like, you know, we love Aragorn and Arwen.
Of course.
But that's like kind of like enhanced in the movies.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the books, it's so dry. They just have a conversation, and they're like, oh my god, I love you so much.
Right.
And it's just a conversation. It's not really this like sensual and erotic as it is in the movie.
Right. No, I think that's. I feel like that's such an interesting. Again, I'll use the word dichotomy with. I sort of with like a lot of the text and like materials that I read throughout my education, just in general, that have had movie adaptations. People are always like, the book is like a better telling of the story, or like the book is, because it was the main source material, like its value, you just lose some of that.
Yeah.
But I think it's so interesting to talk about stories that are
Enhanced
because of the visual media that they're given.
especially when it because like the Lord of the Rings movies were written by women,
Right.
and the Lord of the Rings books were written by Tolkien, who was sexist. No, he wrote like letters to people like venting about like suffrage, like the suffragist movement.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
Gayest man.
Well,
is-
yeah. So people like say like, well, there's like so basically, Tolkien was actually homophobic. So there is kind of like this pushback to the reading of Sam and Frodo and everybody else as queer because he was homophobic and Catholic, but also the evidence that we have for him being homophobic is within his world-building journals that he never expected to be published. So in the
Oh no! They looked up the old tweets.
So in the journals, he like, you know, we read the books and it all seems like very chaste,
Right.
and like, you know, very pure. And then in the like the world building journals that he had, it's sexy. It's sexy. The elves, like, apparently it's so passionate between the elves when they have sex that it has to be very short, otherwise it's too intense.
He was the inception of fanfiction.
So, and, but then also in this text talking about elf sexuality, he explicitly said that homosexuality is not possible. He wrote it in specifically into the world building that there is no such thing as homosexuality and that it is impossible.
Oh, I thought he said verbatim, hey, this shit ain't real.
No, he kind of did. But I honestly, I feel like that's really suspicious.
Oh, duh.
I hate speculating about the sexuality of like public figures and
Of
historical
course.
ones,
Right.
but I feel like at some point there is something to be said when you have to like analyze queer history, and the fact that so like, you know, he was great friends with C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, who's like, they were both like Christian,
Right.
but C.S. Lewis was a lot more Christian than Tolkien was, and he was just like, hey, this is kind of a little gay, a little gay, and Tolkien was like, oh no, and so he like it's just, he wrote into the world building that it's impossible for these characters to be queer,
Right.
and I feel like that is so suspicious.
I think, like, on that point, I want to go on record and say that at no point is the objective of this podcast to erase heterosexuality.
Yes.
I think it's, especially I feel like we've had this conversation in the queer education class that we both are currently taking, that some people are just straight, like heterosexuality is as much of a valid identity, and cisgenderism and heterosexuality are as much of a valid identity as homosexuality and transgenderism and queerness. And so queer history, it's important to highlight, but queer history also incorporates heterosexuality. Like, it's because of the presence of, you know, a bigger spectrum that we see, like, we can identify what queer history is, because we know where it's not.
Yeah. And I just, it feels like, even so, like, when you're like asking the question, are Sam and Frodo gay or not? Like, I mean, or like gay for each other or not.
Right.
There are a few ways we can take this conversation.
Right.
So we can take the conversation to be like, yeah, absolutely. Tolkien, like, you know, was probably, like, you know, working through some of his own stuff and, you know, put it in there. Or we can say that, no, Tolkien was, like, actually homophobic and did not intend this at all. Yeah. However, because of the way the books were written, they're so sensual. Yeah, they're constantly, like, you know, like, kissing each other's, like, hands and cheeks and foreheads. Right. Like, you know, at one point, like, you know, there's this moment in the films where, you know, Frodo wakes up and, you know, Sam is with him and Gandalf's like, he's never left your side. And Ian McKellen who's gay, was just like, he went up to Sean Astin, he was like, it's really important that you grab Frodo's hand in this moment. It's really important because the queer readers are going to be looking for this moment. And in the books, it's so sensual. And he at one point was just like, your hand is so warm. But it was like, I forget the exact wording and I don't have the book with me. Right. It was basically like implied, like, you know, like, what else would you be talking about?
What you think? What are you
so
about?
warm.
What are you thinking about?
It's so warm. It's so warm. I mean your hand. Like it's Tancil's like 2 seconds from falling on the ground.
No, the amount of listen. I gotta write some of these down. I'm sorry, these singers. But no, that is so. I think it's also really important to like also outline. You know, yes. There's been a connection with homophobia and homosexuality, sort of that pipeline of internalized homophobia, and, you know, deflecting that frustration and hate onto other people. But they do not always go hand in hand. Like, some things are just homophobic. And I know it's like a recurring conversation of like, oh, the more homophobic you are, the gayer.
I hate that.
I hate that conversation, which is why I want to, like, outline that that's not what the point is, but in the specific situation, yeah, it is. But like we understand that like those two things, homophobia and homosexuality, are not always connected within the same journey and same person. Some people are just hateful people. Yep. But a lot of the times when we look at examples of homophobia,
like, why are you scared of being turned gay?
Literally, like when we look at it in its purest and like most extreme form, it's very easy to pick out those insecurities. And so that's kind of like the layout of this conversation. Like separately the hate, but also just like identifying where that can stem from most of the time.
Yeah. And like, you know, and then regardless, like again, even if they aren't, like, you know, if they aren't gay, there is, and like, you know, regardless of, you know, the queer readings being so prevalent that it warrants academic discussion as like queer history within this text, everybody is pretty much explicitly queer platonic in this text. And queer platonic, if you don't know what that is, it's basically a branch, like somewhere between being romantic and platonic. Oftentimes it's aromantic people having these relationships. I myself am demi-romantic and in a queer platonic relationship. And they can take form in a few ways. They can be queer platonic without having sex. They can be queer platonic with having sex. And so the way everybody talks about each other is pretty explicitly queer platonic. And Tolkien was building these relationships off of what he experienced in World War I in this area that is so far removed from women. They sought out companionship with men, and that's very much represented in the text here. But yeah, back to like Sam and Frodo really quick. Sean, like I constantly find myself as a person in a queer platonic relationship. I have such a complicated relationship with Lord of the Rings because I'm like, these guys love each other so much, and like I'm constantly starving for more queer platonic representation. But at the same time, whenever I'm watching the movies and I just see Sean Astin looking at Elijah Wood, I'm like, Sean Astin is 100% playing Sam as in love with Frodo.
Kiss.
No, he was just like, oh yeah, I think they should have kissed. Because he was 100%. You can look at, like, in his eyes, you see the love he has for Frodo, and it is not platonic.
And that's the thing that I feel like people don't want to admit, but is a bigger conversation. When you see love, you know it.
Oh my God!
Like
yes.
you can be as good or as bad as reading people, but love is such a universal feeling and language in any capacity. When it's so strong, you can see it. And that sort of adds to the conversation of oh, let's switch into that. Love.
I lost the plot. Now you did.
What is this podcast?
Oh,
this is our gay ramblings.
Yes.
But what was I just talking about?
Love is universal.
When it is, because of how universal it is, you don't even need words, and that adds to the conversation of when we are identifying queerness in different stories and recordings and letters, it's like you can feel it and you can see it. Like, I cannot tell you the amount of times that I have seen or read a book or seen a show where it is either live action or animated, where the way in which either they are drawn or they act, that
Just Vax looking at Keyleth.
Vax
looking at Keyleth.
Yes, literally, where you can feel, and no words are needed. No words are needed, and it's been a recurring thing with heterosexual relationships in media, obviously throughout history. But I think that same lesson can be applied to queer-centric relationships, and the identification of love and that strength of love. It's not a heterocentric thing. Like, that sort of passion and that feeling.
Sorry, my binder is getting to me. Sorry.
No,
if I start coughing, that is why.
I'm going to a whole philosophical talk about the transcending language love and use of.
And then my binder is like, you can't breathe now.
Literally, you're our guest. But no, I think the reason why the conversation of identifying queerness in media, especially now, is because it was such a quieted endeavor historically. And so part of the big thing that I wanted to, and I spoke to Yaz about this, the importance of identifying queerness throughout history helps to answer and expand on conversations about queerness now.
Yes.
That's history in general. Like, history will continue the conversation for occurrences and events in the present. But I think there is something to be said about the way in which we as people who interact with one another and have experiences that are different from one another can all relate to this one feeling of love, and the different ways that it has been displayed and portrayed throughout the entirety of human creation and human art and culture, I think is so notable, and that's why that conversation is so important, because that feeling is so vast.
Oh, yeah.
And
I feel like Lord of the Rings gets that.
Yeah.
Whether or not, they're gay, the love is so strong within these books, and it's just an absolutely transcending thing.
Right.
So I think I'm going to move on a bit just into the horror.
Okay.
We're going to be talking about Dracula.
Of course.
And a lot of horror, as a genre within books. So, novels started to be written around the late 1700s. And so now we're moving into the early 1800s. And it all starts out with Lord Byron. He was a womanizer, a manonizer.
Me, I identify as a manonizer, and I will wear that shirt to the day I die.
Amazing. Yeah, he was a womanizer, he was a manonizer, and everybody knew it. He had lovers galore. Oftentimes, it was just, and it all starts out with Lord Byron's boy toy, Polidori. who he had been like, the object of Byron's affections.
Right.
And so we go into the Geneva writing retreat.
Which we were just talking about before this podcast started.
The Geneva writing retreat is the birth of so much speculative fiction. And
Right.
this is really when, which if you don't know, the whole bunch of writers who are very prominent got together and went to Geneva on a writing retreat, and they had they just did a whole bunch of writing. So there was Lord Byron, there was Mary Shelley, there are other people that I'm forgetting about. But Lord Byron wrote this story about a vampire. It was basically in the same contest that he had with Mary Shelley, where she wrote Frankenstein. Lord Byron wrote a short story about a vampire, and it would later get novelized by his boy toy Polidori. And Polidori was really mad about the way that Byron's attention was no longer focused on him on this writing retreat.
Oh, that's tea.
It's tea.
That's tea.
It is tea.
That is
so
tea.
He was really mad. And again, check out Verily Bitchy's video essay about Dracula. Really interesting. So he ended up writing it and turning the vampire in the story into Lord Byron. Lord Byron is now the predator in this story.
You know what this reminds me of?
Yeah.
They're not within the same weight, but the whole idea of mad about the transferring of attention, it reminds me, if any of you who have seen the series Stranger Things,
Okay.
spoiler warning, season 3 spoiler warning.
Okay.
If you haven't seen it and are interested, we will put like a little spoiler warning, so I would mute
For just a minute or so.
a minute or so. But
Here we go.
There's a scene in the bathroom where the protagonist Steve Harrington and Robin, they were just kidnapped by Russians because it takes place in the 80s during that entire scare. So they're in a bathroom, sort of coming down from a drug trip that they were induced into. And
I've never seen Stranger Things, but I know this scene.
It's such a good scene. But I'm going to, like I said, the weight of it is not in the same context as Byron, but I think it's interesting about the queer frustration of attention. Because in that scene, Robin is canonically a lesbian, and she's coming out to Steve, who is interested in her. And so she asks Steve if they remember a classmate that, was obsessed with Steve when they were in school together, a female classmate. I'm forgetting the name of her on the top of my head. Steve was like, yeah, I remember her. And so while she's explaining, how this girl was so obsessed with Steven, Steve is thinking that it's because Robin was into him, but it was because he was taking that attention that she wanted from that classmate that was all over Steve. And I think that is such... I mean, straight listeners, if you have experienced this, let me know. I'm speaking as a queer person. I think that is such... I want to call it a queer-centric experience.
Oh, yeah.
Where were someone that... Because in the beginning, Robin didn't really like Steve. She thought that he was annoying. But she even said that the worst part of all of this was that she actually started to like him, as a person, which hurt her even more because she's like, now I can see why that other person who's falling over you didn't choose me. Because, because I get it.
Oh.
Right? Isn't it it's such a good scene. If you have not seen Stranger Things, please watch it. It is so good.
I could never get into it. I watched the first season. It was not for me, but you know what?
But that scene rocked me because I feel like as queer people, a lot of us can probably relate to suffering in silence mentality of you have drummed this person up, the person that you want to be with. Whoever they, if they are, the same sex as you, or if it would be a sort of a queer situation, you build up this idea in your head that, like, in a perfect situation it can work out, and that within the right conditions maybe something can happen, but you're watching them go off and be with people in heterosexual relationships, and you're like, you start to almost
Gilmore.
You start to have this frustration with the people that they're seeing, because it's just like, man, like, you're ruining this idea for this person I have of me in my head. But it's like, when you reach the point where you're like, these really are just people that are cool and living their lives, you're like, it's sort of a reflection on yourself.
Oh yeah.
Almost. And like the way that you're responding to the people that are around you, that I feel like can go for people of like all ages. I feel like we've all been there, especially in spaces where queerness is not as celebrated. You kind of just have to watch that sort of thing happen.
Good Luck Baked by Chaperone.
Ah, yes!
Okay, so he wrote this, he novelized it, and everybody knew it was Byron, and it was like crazy. So now we move from that, the iconic Geneva writing retreat, to Oscar Wilde's arrest.
Tell us about it, King.
All right, cool. So Oscar Wilde is like my special interest, and I'm so excited to talk about him next one. And I'm glad we're setting this up, the idea. So Oscar Wilde, if you're listening to this, you probably know who he is and the whole story. So Oscar Wilde was actually friends with Bram Stoker. Because Bram Stoker married Oscar Wilde's ex. So they were sort of friends and admired each other. And then Oscar Wilde gets arrested, and Bram Stoker is just like, I don't know who you are anymore. And he's so ashamed of his own sexuality that he starts, like, going after Oscar Wilde to appear better to the public. And so what he actually ended up doing, within like a few months of Oscar Wilde's conviction, he starts writing Dracula. Dracula is supposed to be Oscar Wilde.
Bro.
Instead of Byron being the predator, it is now Oscar Wilde.
Y'all, it all started with Geneva.
It all started with Geneva! So yeah. Dracula is Oscar Wilde.
Right.
And it also, there's so much, like, eroticism and, like, the drinking of blood. Dracula only drinks the blood of women, but from women.
Right.
But then he gives the blood of men to the women to drink from. It's a way of avoiding the gayness while still being gay. And so around the moving from that into the 50s, we've had Dracula as this like scary creature, and around the 50s they're like, hey, what if we made him sexy? So in the 1950s version of like the 1950s Dracula movie, they start making him a little bit sexy and a little bit like promiscuous, and there's eroticism in the way that he interacts with women in the movie, and then he's over a man, and there's the scene in the book where he's just like, he almost can't resist the pull of this man, and you can see it in his face in the 50s, but then he moves away. And it's erotic. There's like an inherent eroticism to vampires.
Right.
And especially with knowing the connection with Oscar Wilde, Dorian Gray not explicitly, but implicitly has a blood kink. Chapter 11, at the very end of it, it's just like there's this like really weird fixation on blood, and then they made that blood kink canon in the 2009 adaptation with Ben Barnes.
Right.
So there's more of a connection to the blood and Oscar Wilde there.
Right.
And so from the 50s, when we have vampires now being sexy, everybody wants to do the sexy vampires.
Of course.
Vampires are so sexy now,
Vampires
and
are
they're
so hot.
no, they are.
Like we're commenting on this as consumers of vampires.
Listen. I am a big Astarion fan. Yeah.
Don't get me. No,
I love the social experiment that is Astarion.
We're gonna have to have a whole podcast episode just on Baldur's Gate. Just on
So
Baldur's Gate.
good.
But
Okay.
I think before you continue on to that, I think to like sort of tie it back into this idea of the events that are happening, with Oscar Wilde in terms of his portrayal of men and sort of that dichotomy I was talking about earlier, with the churches during the Renaissance era, of like this attention to like male centric like eroticism. Apparently, in case no one's looking, I Wikipedia'd while Jaskier was giving us that amazing lecture. But they like a lot of his literary works that are lectured like in like the U.S. and Canada, in art and other stuff is referred to like as an English Renaissance.
Oh yeah.
Which I think is so it's almost mirroring sort of this portrayal of humanities and the intimacies between people.
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
But obviously still in a very homoerotic light. And male intimate kind of light that I think is I love it when history repeats itself.
Yeah, and so that's what we're moving into is using speculative fiction as a metaphor for queerness and vampires especially.
Yeah.
They're I forget which TV show it is because I haven't seen it, but one of the TV shows says that being bisexual is inherent to vampirism, and then now we've got what we do in the shadows, and everybody's bisexual in that because being bisexual is almost an inherent nature to vampirism because it all goes back to Lord Byron, especially when we get into Interview with the Vampire.
Ooh.
So Anne Rice explicitly said that she wanted to go back to the Byronic vampire, moving away from the Dracula Oscar Wilde vampire. We're going back to the Byronic vampire.
Right.
And Anne Rice, listen, I really hate her so much because she sued people who wrote fan fiction, but also she's the reason we have AO3 now.
So it's pros and cons, gotta weigh.
And Anne Rice is very interesting when you're talking about dead authors and their queerness. She was most likely trans. She talks a lot about things in about how she views Louis and Lestat, and she's just their gender is kind of absent to me, and she really connected to them, almost writing them to work through her own gender and dysphoria that she mentioned, which is really interesting. And I, as a trans person, oh my god, writing writing gay fan fiction is a lot of my gender is tied to my sexuality being gay, just living through that. And so Anne Rice definitely made really in the modern sphere cemented vampires as queer. And now we've got the really awesome adaptation. I refuse to read the books, but I love the show. So good. Yeah, and so now we've got, the sexy Anne Rice vampires, and then, now we've got Twilight.
With two men fighting over Bella, what?
Yeah. It's really interesting because we have the progression from the Geneva writing retreat to Oscar Wilde's arrest to Dracula becoming sexy in the 50s for some reason to Interview with the Vampire, and now we've got Twilight. It's a fascinating progression of events.
And you know what all those events tie back to? A motherfucking Renaissance.
The motherfucking Renaissance.
Motherfucking Renaissance.
So, and moving on from horror, we're getting into sci-fi and X-Men, which is pretty much a really good way to talk about how speculative fiction has always had so much queer coding. Because speculative fiction, when you're creating a world that is not our own, you have to tie it back to elements of humanity.
Yeah, definitely.
And so a great way to tie it back to elements of humanity is you're using metaphor. When you're using metaphor to talk about problems in the world, you end up talking a lot about social justice.
Right.
I mean, Lord of the Rings, for example, which is, the beginning of fantasy, he was really mad about his town getting torn up for industrialism. Sauron and Mordor is a metaphor for industrialism.
Right.
And deforestation. There's this scene where they're just pulling down these trees en masse.
Right.
And so X-Men has always been a metaphor for social justice. oftentimes in a whitewashy way.
Yeah,
Which is why I really prefer the queer reading.
But small victories, I suppose.
Small victories. And it's getting better as time goes on, because they're all so gay. Like sometimes I feel like Charles and Eric, Professor X and Magneto, are like the blueprint for Dumbledore and Grindelwald.
Oh, duh.
Yeah,
Oh,
they walked so that Dumbledore and Grindelwald could trip and fall flat on their faces.
On their face, so that Wolverine and Deadpool could run.
So that Wolverine and Deadpool can run. Okay, so we're gonna be moving into that. But like, think about it. Like, all the characters are so queer. Like, Storm is punk.
Oh, I thought that from that moment. That's when I realized, because I think one of my childhood crushes was Storm.
Oh, I love Storm.
That's when I was
Same
like,
here.
I'm not straight. It's not completely. There's a love happening here that I don't think is. I'm not feeling it in that kind of way.
My gay awakening was Susan from Narnia.
Really?
Yes.
Really?
Susan from Narnia.
You know what?
She's a lesbian in my mind. You can't change my mind on that.
You know
like,
what?
Like she and Caspian are in a lavender marriage.
You know what? No, I can get behind that.
Right?
I can get behind that.
Okay.
Let's
So,
do it
like,
every day.
Storm is punk, and being punk is so queer. I mean,
so queer.
I could.
Oh
my god! I
gosh.
can't wait to talk about the evolution of the word punk from Polari.
Right.
Like, punk was a Polari word.
Oh my gosh, I'll bring in
It
so
meant
much
twink.
music.
It meant twink.
It was
in
the
Polari.
earlier version.
And we'll talk about Polari next episode. And then you've got Kitty, who's played by Elliot Page.
I've been slamming this table so much during this entire recording, and I'm praying that this adds to the dramatic factor of what we're talking about. Otherwise, it's going to be very annoying.
But yeah, Kitty was played by Elliot Page, and like in the comics, she's got the whole thing going with Ilyana. Like they were roommates.
They were.
We
We all know.
They were like wrestling in bed. Like, come on, guys.
Roommates, y'all. Roommates too.
And then there's Wolverine and Jean Grey and Cyclops, and they've got their whole love triangle going on. And now in the comics, they all live together, which implications.
The queer to roommate pipeline is crazy.
Like it's just like maybe they're in a polycule. Who knows? Who knows?
Who knows? Who's to say?
And especially with Wolverine, there's so much queerness with Wolverine. There's the very popular trans mask headcanon because he's 5'4", and I don't know if I were gonna put this in here, but the song "I Would Hate Me Too."
Yes.
He's the 5'4" man whore with slits in his fists.
Listen, we all saw that scene where he and Devil got out that car.
Oh, and I'm about to talk about it. I'm about to talk in it. Okay, he's a very popular trans mask headcanon because he's short.
Right.
And then there's in one of the universes he's gay and in a relationship with Hercules.
Send me the link.
Okay. And then now we have Deadpool 3.
Nom 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 nom.
There's so much subtle queer bliss in that movie because they did what they could. It's such a great example of queer coding versus queer baiting. A lot of people will say it's queer baiting. It's not. It's queer coding. It's meant to be for the people who can see it.
It's meant to be subliminal.
Even like straight people walked out of that theater and went, "Damn, they fucked in that Honda Odyssey. They were knee deep in the passenger seat."
They were knee deep. Oh, they were
knee
screaming,
deep
they
in the
were
Honda Odyssey.
screaming for Jesus in that Honda. That is crazy. No, but oh my goodness! And listen, you cannot tell me. Look at the entire. For my straight listeners, I'm really gonna listen up, okay? Give me a second.
Let's go.
Everyone, shut up. Sit still. You cannot tell me, even my most heterocentric, straightest listener, you cannot look at the lineup of Marvel heroes from the earliest inceptions of that universe and tell me, oh yeah, all straight.
Yeah.
Spider-Man, twink. Literally, he is the twink of the Marvel universe.
He's the twink of the Marvel universe.
Look at that.
So is Loki.
So is Loki. And Loki also, and I love this whole conversation. We need to talk about the men and women, the female and male gaze for an
Oh
episode, I
my
think,
God,
is so
yes.
necessary. Because
My therapist and I have a joke about how men think that women want Thor, but women want Loki.
yes, that's what I was about to say. That, like, literally, like, and also, like, I feel, and also the whole idea of like the queer villain, you know, because
I mean, in the comics, Loki's an anti-hero.
yeah, and I also like the term antihero. I feel like there's because I have always, and maybe this is also talks to my queerness, but like as a kid, I always sympathized or like was drawn towards the stories of like antagonists more so than protagonists.
I mean, it's all started out with the queer coding of Disney villains.
Literally, like that frustration of, you know, being ostracized for not fitting the mold. And I think Disney is a good like reference because they do a really good job of like the filming and not only queer coding but also using like, you know, composition and color, like
Oh my God,
artistically, they make really solid
My favorite
movies.
old Disney movie is Sleeping Beauty because of the artists in it.
And like the whole idea of villains and their ostracization and putting them in a completely different viewpoint and like completely different color palette tone than the rest of the majority of the protagonist
Amazing.
cast. That
Wonderful.
shouts queer coding. Like it's because that's at the core of it a sense of being different and being put in a predominantly like what's the term for homogenous space,
Yeah.
and having that one difference
Ugh.
keep you from attaining that same amount
Beautiful.
of
Horrible, but
love.
beautiful.
Literally horrible but beautiful, but that difference keeping you from attaining that level of solace and happiness that you see those other people achieving that has led you down this path of being the villain or the antagonist. I think at the core that story can resonate with a lot of queer people.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of queer people.
Yeah. And, you know, then, you know, there's Nightcrawler. And his whole story is basically, my inherent nature is against my faith. So that's the queer coding of that is just and you know he's played by Liam O'Brien in one of the
Shut up.
Yeah.
Y'all, I'm about to have me and Jaskier gotta set up a queer movie night. And
Oh my God, yes.
I'm gonna have them like run me through like the most like the immense pinnacles of queer media that I've apparently overlooked. Because are you kidding me? Okay, no.
Yeah. And so, like, you know, there's also the fact that, like, their powers manifest around puberty, which is when a lot of people realize they're queer.
Yeah.
And it's just the metaphors are. And so I just think about, you know, this moment in the first X-Men movie where Jean Grey is talking to Senator Kelly and all of these U.S. senators trying to, like, be like, hey, don't do this forced registration thing, which is just parallels back to the Holocaust with, like, Jewish, Roma, and trans people. They had to register themselves, and then, like, you know, for the safety of people, like, safety, air quotes, you can't see the air quotes.
Yeah.
But, yeah, and so they had to register themselves. And so she's like, people who out themselves as mutants, they're met with violence. They expose them, and it's like, well, what do they have to hide if they're not a danger? And, you know, he brings up the idea to, like, you know, all of these, Senator Kelly brings up the idea to all of these people in this space that, like, you know, you don't want your kids going to school with these people. And it just feels so familiar. And I feel like I'm about 2 seconds away from hearing about mutant bathroom bans.
Oh, my gosh. It's the conversation of the dehumanization of queer people because, and I will believe this to the day I die, queer, what I view as queer is unapologetic acceptance of your humanity.
Yeah.
And I think the culture around conservative heterosexuality is, you know, when when men are in a space where they want to, you know, please other men or making up these rules, it's because they don't have that confidence and unapologetic acceptance and love within themselves. And they're seeing people who embrace that without question. Whereas they have found themselves lost or frustrated, or they have been brought up to downplay that part of themselves. And so seeing other people, sort of happy with this whole ideal that they were taught was wrong, it's almost easier to get people on your side by making them seem like less of human, when really it's you ignoring your own humanity. And yet you not being able to come to terms with yourself and be honest with yourself as much as you're able to see them because of how you've been brought up or how we have conditioned, people, these constructs, these societal constructs of people to behave with other people, which I think is such a very in-depth, it's a sucky conversation because then it goes into obviously the foundations of feminism, but it just sucks that in a world that men created, that there is no space for them for men, especially nowadays, to genuinely love themselves. And
Lord of the Rings,
which is why we have artists to do it, to help us do it,
Exactly, and I feel like that's like a really good closing point.
Right.
Because, that's what I've got to say.
That's what we got.
Yeah, because speculative fiction, within that space, it offers this great potential for talking about empathy and building, using metaphor to talk about these complex issues when we're trying to save the world in such an epic way within speculative fiction. You've got the world-ending stuff in fantasy where this party of heroes is going to save the world. In horror, you've got this, monster. So who is the monster in society? Let's talk about that. Right. In science fiction, it's often dystopia or moving into another planet. And so you have themes of pollution and things like that, or capitalism. And these genres offer different things to us. In fantasy, you've got a hero saving the world, or you've got somebody that we're fighting against. And in science fiction, we talk about the most fucked up aspects of humanity and how to fix them.
Right.
And that's such a great space for queer coding.
It is such a great space for queer coding.
Hello, beautiful listener. Thank you so much for choosing to listen to the Sunshines from Rainbow podcasts.
Next episode, we will be discussing how the 19th century aestheticism movement has stuck with the queer community and be discussing the birth of drag that happened in that time period.
You can find us on Podbean as well as on YouTube.
We also have an Instagram, and that is Sunshines from Rainbows, and we currently have a website that is under construction, and you can find that at sarpod.my.canva.site. It should be up and running hopefully soon. We also have an email, and you can email us at sunshinesfromrainbows@gmail.com with any questions you may have for us, any things that you want to hear us talk about in future episodes. We would love to hear it.
And with every episode we do, we want to give the audience a question to expand on and pontificate on based on the discussion that we have had in the given episode. And this episode's discussion question is there a piece of media that you are familiar with or that you enjoy that has queer context in it that you've picked up on, but it isn't so explicit? Let us know in the comments on this episode.
Thank you guys so much for listening. We'll see you next time.